virtual Historic District Design Guideline Open House. I'm Anya Gran with the Planning Department. Also with the Planning Department is Judy Johnson, who's going to be helping us with some of the background technical stuff, and Corey Lyles. And I also have Heather Slane, our consultant on the project, with us, and Angela Stiefbold, who is a member of the Historic District Commission, as well as Josh Gerlitz. And Angela also served as our chair of our Historic District Design Guideline Committee. And so with that, we're going to just give you a quick presentation and then open up the floor to public comment. Let me just share my screen here. All right, are we all seeing the full view of the slide? Yeah, okay. So just a couple helpful hints for the virtual environment. If you're not speaking, please.
And yeah, we don't see it yet.
You don't see it yet? Oh, geez. All right, well, let me figure this out. Do you see anything?
Nope.
We see you.
Oh, I'm glad you can see me.
It's coming now, I think. So give it a second. You're good.
There it is.
Is it the full screen view too?
Yeah, you're perfect.
Okay, all right, well, that's fun. All right. So a couple helpful hints since we're in a virtual environment. If you're not speaking, please make sure to mute your microphone. That'll help us with some of the echo and noise in the background. We're asking everybody to ask one question or provide one comment at a time and then let the next person speak. And we can always take a couple of rounds of this until everybody's had a chance to provide their comments. You can, if you have it in Zoom, you can use the raise your hand feature to provide public comment, or you can write speak in the chat box and we'll call on you. The meeting is recorded and we'll make sure it's available online. And then I just wanted to point out that anything you add to the chat is also part of the public record and can be seen. So tonight, like I said, we're going to just give you a very brief presentation and then there'll be an opportunity for public comment. One of the things we did want to quickly point out is that we are going to start referring to this document as principle and standards. There has been recent updates to the North Carolina general statutes, and it's requiring that the commission adopt principles and standards rather than design guidelines to help in their congruity findings. Who uses the design standards? I think you all know that it's used as property owners as they plan exterior changes. The Historic District Commission uses it to review the appropriateness of the proposed exterior changes and to make sure that these future changes are congruous with the town's local historic districts and our character. And then staff also uses the design standards to provide administrative approvals for minor projects. The HDC does review exterior alterations. This can include changes in exterior materials, new construction and additions, the relocation and demolition of buildings, and other significant site changes to man-made features. The current design guidelines that we have were adopted back in 2002, and they were meant to be a living document because they play such a crucial role in the Historic District Commission's review of certificates of appropriateness or COAs. The design guidelines do need to provide a sound basis for the consistent review of applications. The HDC has been requesting updated guidelines now for several years, but we were able to move forward with this project starting in 2019 when we received a certified local government or CLG grant to complete the project, and the total cost of the project is $25,000. This was a matching grant, and so we received $10,000 from the SHPO or the State Historic Preservation Office to fund the project, and the Planning Department provided the remaining $15,000. So the scope of this project was really meant to provide a clear description of the COA application and the review process. We wanted to expand and have a better understanding of the special character of the local historic districts. We wanted to make sure we provided some guidance regarding the maintenance of historic materials. There's also some new and expanded sections in this document that Heather will touch on in a minute. You know, our current design guidelines are black and white and they're not searchable online so we wanted to make sure that we not only had updated photos and graphics, but that we also had an online or digital format that was easier for everyone to use. So the process for this was that we, received community input. This was first received at our kickoff meeting back in February of 2020. Since then, we've had virtual Historic District Design Guideline Committee meetings, as well as HDC or Historic District Commission meetings. I'll let Angela maybe speak a little bit about the Design Guideline Committee and the work that they've done, if you don't mind, Angela.
Sure, yeah. So the Design Guideline Committee is a subcommittee of the HTC. It's myself and Josh Gerlitz and Nancy McCormick. And we had one meeting in person before COVID hit, but basically what we've done is we have every time we've reviewed materials provided to us by Heather, our consultant, as she's gone along, and given feedback, answered questions that she has about, how we have done things in Chapel Hill in the past, what we're hoping to get clarified for us to make better decisions, and all those meetings. So we had one in person, and then after that, they were on Zoom pretty much monthly starting was it August of last year? They've all those meetings are were recorded and are on the town site, the town's webpage about the design standards update. We also all were privy and had sent to us the same public comments that are all posted on that town website. So we had that also in mind as we worked with Heather to come up with this last draft of the guidelines document. And that's about where we stand. And you let me know if I left anything important out.
No, it sounds bad. Good. We can always circle back to it. And then the other feedback that we'll receive as part of this process is obviously from the Historic District Commission themselves. We've met with them in October and November for input based on some of the committee's discussions, as well as the delegation of approval authority. And so we've asked that the HDC commissioners start individually reviewing the updated design standards, and they're going to begin their discussions on this project already on Thursday, January 21st, which is of this week. Okay, and with that, I will let Heather go for it.
So I just wanted to touch on some of the major changes that happened. And I say major, not that that there was a change in the things that are regulated, but the sort of areas that where we added a lot of information and clarity, I think. So we added, go back for a second, Anya.
Thanks.
We added a section on foundations. Before, you had information about masonry, but not foundations specifically. We split the section on windows and doors. So you had one section that covered both of those previously. So we split it into two sections to just be able to provide more information. We added patios to the discussion of decks that you already had. And we added a section on disaster preparedness and recovery. That's something that the State Preservation Office is requiring for all of the grant projects going forward. And that is largely in response to hurricane damage and recovery on the coast, but it's something that they want to see in all of the standards. So it's that section's pretty minimal for you all in Chapel Hill. I think one of the other areas that we added a lot of clarity to, I hope we had a lot of discussion about, was substitute materials and when those materials are appropriate and where they're appropriate. And then, as Anya noted, we expanded the character essays. You actually didn't have a character essay in your earlier guidelines. And because a lot of the guidelines talk about things that are appropriate to the character of the district, it's really important to have it written down what the character of the district is and what the important things for the character are. And then it expanded introductions to each of the sections that really focus on just maintenance and best practices. And you'll see when we get into the formatting, if you've looked at it, that that information is in a different sort of visual template than the standards, so that the standards really stand out as these specific things that the guidelines are, that the standards are being applied, as opposed to just the information on maintenance. And then the other section that added a lot of information was in new construction. In your previous guidelines, I think you had 1 page for new construction, which is very brief. And we talked a lot about this and talked largely about adding information about scale, setback, and massing, so that we could really try to keep things in line with the things that are on the streetscape without trying to sort of dictate style and personal preference. So all of these sections on materials and details, doors, windows, porches, those are all more form-based and not necessarily detail-based, but really to give a lot more clarity as to what is appropriate in the historic districts. We also called out, you had a section on additions previously, but we talked about dormer additions specifically because it seems like it's something that has started coming up. So we just wanted to go ahead and address that. And then with new garages, carports, and accessory buildings, much of that discussion is really focused on location and where on the site those things are appropriate. And then again, focused on the scale and massing and less on the detailing. So one of the other things that we did was really look at the community feedback, both from the first public meeting that we had in February, that I'm sure many of you were at, and then from the emails and information that Anya's been receiving over the last 9 months. So one of the things, there was an interest in using shall or should or more forceful language instead of using should. And the way that the guidelines are written now are mostly written in action format. So it's saying that design new additions to do this instead of you should design this to do this, if that makes sense. And then another thing to keep in mind is that not all of the standards are applicable to every project. So within each set of standards, there may be things that do and do not apply to different projects. And hopefully that's clear. It may not be clear in just reading them, but hopefully in looking at them against applications, it will be clear. There was also an interest in allowing more staff approvals for minor work. This is partly to streamline the process and to keep the commission's decisions focused on larger issues and not sort of every little thing that comes up that the staff can really handle. So this went hand in hand with creating the new guidelines, the new standards. I'm so used to calling them guidelines, the new standards, so that there wasn't enough clarity that the staff felt like they could make those decisions. Your previous standards had 5 or 6 things that were very specific that staff could approve. And so we've greatly expanded that. And that should hopefully help projects move through faster because there are a lot more projects then that don't need to go to a full commission, that the staff can just approve them and sign off on a COA. So as I mentioned, one of the things that we talked a lot about was material selection and when replacement materials are appropriate, where they're appropriate, and what materials should be used. So we talked at length in our committee meetings about which materials are appropriate. The main sort of overarching idea is that where there are existing historic materials, that those remain. And then there's a lot more flexibility where things are deteriorated beyond repair, and then for new construction and additions. The State Preservation Office doesn't allow endorsing specific brands of materials. So you'll see things like composite and fiber cement instead of hardy board or things like that. So, and the same thing with recommended cleaners and things like that. We have to use the sort of the generic name for things. So in some ways it almost seems cumbersome to have to describe the material instead of calling it by a brand name, but that's why it's in there like that. Next one. So as I mentioned, there was a lot of feedback about new construction, about style, things like that. The committee and the standards in general, we don't want to prohibit modern and contemporary architecture. Chapel Hill has 200 years of architecture in these districts, and thinking about the fact that the buildings from the 60s and 70s are themselves historic now. And so really thinking about current building as part of that continuum of architecture. So the new construction focuses on form rather than prescribing any specific style. And then hopefully we also tried to add language in the standards that reflects those sort of mid-century buildings and also the later buildings, because you do have construction from the 80s and 90s in your districts. And so they sort of need to be treated a little differently than buildings from the 1890s. So hopefully the standards reflect that. In terms of new construction, the main focus on garages was making them less conspicuous. So not disallowing new construction of garages, but really focusing the standards on material selection, ensuring that the mass and scale of new garages is subordinate to the primary structure on the site. So there's not a sort of hard line as to what size a new garage can be. It really is reflective of the site and what that site can handle. And then trying to really emphasize that garages should be behind the main house or at the rear of the lot. The Chapel Hill and a lot of communities are interested more in sustainability than they used to. We talked sort of at length about solar panels and where they were appropriate. And so we found examples from a couple of other communities that had some really good guidance on placement and installation to sort of minimize visibility, but not disallow them from the historic district by any means. And then these last three slides are focused on concerns that the community had that we can't necessarily address in the standards. So one of the things that we sort of were up against was that we didn't want to duplicate regulation that's already covered in the LUMO. We were really concerned, and the planning department certainly was concerned about having things being regulated differently through different documents and there being conflicts between those. And additionally, having things have to go through multiple levels of review for the same thing. So because the LUMO covers sign regulation pretty significantly, and because the majority of your downtown is not in the local historic districts, we added very little in terms of regulations for signs. There were also comments suggesting floor area ratios for new construction. And we really felt through the planning department and the legal team that those things belonged in the LUMO and that the standards should really focus on form and sort of congruity with the district and not setting specific number ratios on things, but really focusing the new construction, especially to focus on the context and then providing the updated document to hopefully illustrate that. There was also a lot of concern about landscaping and trees, specifically protecting mature trees, streetscapes, things like that. While your current guidelines, your 2002 guidelines did have regulations regarding trees, the town council has never actually granted the HDC the authority to regulate landscape features like that. So the HDC has the authority in the LUMO to regulate man-made structures like walls, walkways, things like that, fences, but not actual trees. So there is language about plants and trees and tree canopies and things in the narrative of the document, but there are no standards requiring specific things for plantings or trees. And then finally, there's always concern, we talked about this at our opening meeting, about parking, student rentals, and the condition of properties. And unfortunately, the way that design standards and the HDC work is that they cannot regulate building use or they cannot require building maintenance. So those are things that, while they are major issues, need to be addressed in other departments of the planning department.
Thanks, Heather. So just a quick brief update on our next steps. So like I said before, we're going to have Historic District Commission meetings dedicated to the design standards this Thursday and next Thursday. Heather is working with the SHPO office to review the design standards, and they will provide us some comments. We'll continue the discussion with the HDC as necessary past January 28th. We'll take the feedback that we received from the HDC and update it into the draft document. And then in the future, and hopefully the near future, the HDC will adopt the design guidelines. So again, this is just really an opportunity for us to hear from the community and for the public to ask any questions they have about this project or provide any input. No decisions are being made at this meeting tonight. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen if I can. And we can probably take public comment. So again, if you'd like to speak, if you can find it and you have it, you can use the raise your hand button. Otherwise, in the group chat to everyone, just write speak and we'll make sure we call on you. All right, looks like our first speaker is Bev.
Hi, everybody. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to speak. And thank you also to the commission members who have worked so long and hard on these new standards. And actually to all of you who are working to protect the historic districts, thank you. So my statement is actually quite short. I've written it out so that I can be succinct. And here it is. The proposed wording on standing in the standards should be removed. It is not the duty of the commission to decide who has standing. Everyone who lives in Chapel Hill benefits from the existence of the historic districts. They create and add immeasurably to the character, the charm, and the history of the town. The residents of the district benefit even more. Studies have shown that the existence of the district adds to the value of all of the homes in it. The districts exist and will continue to operate correctly only at the will of the property owners in the districts. It is imperative that the residents have the opportunity to speak and be encouraged to speak at the hearings for applications of certificates of appropriateness. Nothing in the standards should discourage the residents from letting their evaluation of an application be known. The new emphasis on standing in the standards sends the message that only the adjacent neighbors have any right to speak on an application. It may be the case if a decision of the commission goes to court that only certain people will be judged by the court to have standing. The standards should encourage residents' participation in the processes of the commission. Thank you.
Thanks. Is there anybody else who is interested in speaking? Linda Brown, I see you have your hand raised, so I'll call on you next.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering about the new states or the recent state statute that allows the Historic District Commission to refer the appeal of a denial directly to Superior Court. When I was looking at the algorithm in the new document that talks about the process of going through a COA, I noticed that it ends with referral to Board of Adjustment. Could somebody speak to that? And if that change from the state statutes is going to be incorporated somehow?
I believe the state statute did give us the opportunity to either refer appeals of HDC decisions to the BOA or to the Supreme Court. And I believe it was the preference for the planning department that we should keep it with the Board of Adjustment. However, I would point out that we're actually talking about the Section 160D updates this Thursday at the Historic District Commission. So if you have specific questions, they might get answered then.
Can I add to that?
Oh, thank you, Corey.
Yes. Hi, Corey Lyles with the Planning Department. So yeah, there is a change in state statute around options for appeals of Preservation Committee decisions. It does need to be all one way or the other. I believe you said suggested maybe a choice by the commission, but it needs to be spelled out in LUMO whether the appeal body for HDC decisions is the Board of Adjustment or NC Superior Court. So every appeal would be treated the same way, depending on how council chooses to define it. Currently, our ordinance says Board of Adjustment for appeals. It can stay that way. As Anya mentioned, the HDC is going to talk about that at an upcoming meeting. Council is going to talk about that at the February 17th work session. So there's opportunity to change, there's pros and cons of each. So certainly welcome feedback that anybody has.
All right, Randy, do you want to be next?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I don't know if it's okay to go away from the last topic about the process of appeals, but kind of had a little bit of a different direction on this. I don't know, some of you know me. I'm the president of a local design build company, and we're sort of frequent flyers in the historic district, if you will. We currently have 2 projects under construction in the district, 3 more in planning, and I'm interviewing for 4 more in the historic districts in Chapel Hill. And I think that illustrates my vested interest in the process, and also some pride for doing some really good work in the districts. 100% of our clients, not some, but 100% of our clients express unsolicited reservations about the COA process and share that they've heard horror stories. And 2 of my clients in the past year chose not to purchase, renovate, expand, and restore homes in the district because of the barrier to investment and restoration imposed by the HDC. And obviously this is unfortunate at best. It's exactly the opposite of what the goal of the HDC is. And worse yet, one of these projects was the William Coker House. And these are clients that we built for previously in Chapel Hill. I really like them. They're really cool people. They're invested in the Chapel Hill community. They want to retire here. They went to UNC. They're passionate about preservation and the restoration, specifically of the Coker House. And they have the resources to complete the project. But because the process isn't, at least yet, fair, predictable, clear, that they're unwilling to make that investment. And I can't say as I blame them. I feel like the guidelines are an opportunity to create that fair and clear and expeditious and predictable process that encourages investment rather than dissuades it. And I've been advocating for a year now or more about some ideas to help that happen. And I'm struggling with how few of those things have been incorporated in the guidelines are now standards rewrite. And one of the questions that I sent to Anya earlier today related to the value of the grant that is apparently constraining us to follow the format of the national standards. And I think that, and I just heard Anya, thank you for answering that question. It sounds like that's about $10,000. And one of the reasons why feedback from homeowners that have recently gone through the application process and practitioners that, like builders and architects that have also recently and regularly go through the application process, is that $10,000 is nothing compared to the cost of what it takes to go through an extended certificate of appropriateness application. It's literally chicken feed. So if we're making decisions about the future of the way the guidelines, what they include, or the standards, excuse me, what they include and how they're formatted based on that $10,000 grant, we have the tail wagging the dog. I will just quickly run through some of the things that I've been advocating for, and that's to include practitioners and homeowners in the process, because they really are the group that understands how the rubber meets the road. And this is also actually a requirement from the National Park Service, but to coordinate and connect concise and clear design guidelines with the LUMO. Right now, that's not happening. I know there's an anticipated LUMO rewrite, but we've had a litany of examples of why conflicts or misunderstandings between the LUMO and the guidelines have thrown a wrench into certificates of application. And I have a list as long as my arm of examples of how that's happened. And reading the introduction to the guidelines and listening to a prior presentation, we still haven't managed to emphasize that the COA application is a quasi-judicial process and that public opinion is irrelevant for those quasi-judicial decisions. And that has to be emphasized. We also, and I'm delighted to see some new information on new construction standards. And hopefully that will deal with the HGC acting to some extent as a de facto zoning board, and limiting uses that are allowed by zoning but rejected by the COA application process. And then I'll just touch on one other thing, and I know I'm going on for a bit, but I'm struggling to deal with how the design standards are clearer and key to the certificate of appropriateness application process when there's tons of information, even in the section that's defined as the standards in each one, that's focused on maintenance and whether you patch or splice a board rather than replace that board. There is no argument that takes whether you splice or patch a board or how that building is maintained to congruity, which is the narrow way that the state legislature defines the purpose of a certificate of appropriateness. You know, I'd love to hear feedback or response on sort of how that went off the rails and why the design standards look a lot like the design guidelines that haven't worked for years.
Well, I can touch briefly on the Secretary of the Interior standards. So this is the Secretary of the Interior standards is the nationally accepted rubric for the treatment of historic properties. It's very typical for local design guidelines to be based on the Secretary of the Interior standards, and then a lot of times it serves as that base so that it can then be expanded into specific sections. So, you know, where the Secretary of the Interior standards might have a whole treatment about what you do with wood, a local design guideline or local standards would talk about what's the appropriate like wood door supposed to look like in a historic district. And I can send you this information tomorrow, but the State Historic Preservation Office actually puts out a historic preservation manual, and it talks about how any work that is done through the grant money that's given to us by the National Park Service has to meet the Secretary's standards. And I know, Heather, you've done a lot more of these projects than I probably have, so I don't know if I'm missing anything you want to elaborate on that.
No, I think the main point is that the Secretary standards are the national standard for historic buildings. So, and those basic standards are that you repair rather than replace, and that new changes be complementary and not sort of distracting from historic buildings. So it's the idea of repair rather than replace is a firmly based in the Secretary standards. We really strove to remove most of the maintenance, all of the maintenance really from the standards and to put it in the narrative. So we went through with a sort of fine-tooth comb. So any references to cleaning materials or how to sort of maintain materials, we removed from the standards because those are not things that people would get a COA for. To really ensure that the things that were in the standards themselves are things that people would get a COA for. I'm still waiting to hear back from the State Preservation Office. We removed all of the standards for archaeology because you wouldn't necessarily try to get a COA if you happen to be digging in your yard and found something. You wouldn't go to the commission for that. So that's really what we tried to do. And the same thing with landscaping, to remove anything that the commission didn't have authority over, to remove all of those from the standards and leave them simply in a narrative sort of best practices situation.
The archaeology is a good example. I have had a commissioner vote no on a certificate of appropriateness application because of a potential undocumented and unknown possible future archaeological site in the location of the addition. But it's a perfect illustration of why the process gets confused with irrelevant information. So if the design standards become the design standards and there's an archaeology section, I absolutely guarantee you that that will cause confusion and problems in the certificate of appropriateness process. The second thing relates to the repair and replace. Well, I understand that that's the national preservation standard. It's not the state standard for passing a certificate of appropriateness. And it's that conflict between the 10 items in the Secretary of Interior standards and which one of those relate to congruity and which one of those don't. That is the struggle, I think, for using this as a base, certainly for making quasi-judicial decisions, again, under this very narrow standard. And if it's the grant, the $10,000 grant that's throwing the switch that makes us want to sort of check all these boxes and follow that run, and even have those conflicts between the state legislation and how the body's actually making decisions, I think it's not worth the $10,000. I think you should. I think we should fund this a different way. I can't possibly see an argument where splicing or patching a piece of wood on a window trim can be a basis for making a congruity decision about that project in Chapel Hill. And I'm anxious to see if anybody else can come up with one, but I don't think that's it.
Well, I think that one of the attorney for the HDC has also been reviewing these, so that may be a question for him.
That sounds like a good plan. I would also point out that Bev has asked that she can speak again.
Thank you. I would like to emphasize that public opinion is not irrelevant to the decisions that the Historic District Commission makes. Anybody from the public can provide credible evidence as to whether a proposed change is congruous or not. And that information can be extremely helpful to all of the members of the Historic District Commission. And so I will reiterate my statement that there should be nothing in these standards that discourage the public from participating. In fact, the commission should welcome and encourage all of the members, all of the people who live in the district, as well as everybody who lives in town, to familiarize themselves with the issues that come before you and speak to you about them. That's the only way that the historic districts are going to work. Then the Historic District Commission can be the judge of whether the comments by the citizens are relevant or not, and they can be the judge as to whether there is credible evidence of congruity or not. As you can tell, I feel very strongly about this, and I can't quite believe that the present town council would want anything in any of their regulations that discourage the people of Chapel Hill from presenting their opinions to either both the council and all of its representative boards and commissions. And I sincerely hope that that is not the case. Thank you again.
I did notice, Susan Smith, you have your hand raised. Would you like to go next?
Okay, yeah, sure. I really agree with what Beverly Kwolek just mentioned. I mean, this is, the historic districts are places that benefit everyone in the town. And being a commissioner it was vital to hear what people would say. And they brought out different points that I might not have seen in my review of the COA. So I certainly know the town wouldn't want a lack of public comment. So I certainly think that that's why we have an open meeting. Otherwise, what is the point? We could just take the COAs in and decide on them. It just doesn't make sense without having other people in the community who are going to be affected by this to weigh in. But what I wanted to say, first of all, is that I really appreciate all the work that's been done so far to get us where we are at this point. And I just want to make a few other general comments. Would that be okay? Okay. Well, I'm hoping that the council members and commissioners and our community at large will embrace the steps that are needed to protect the special character of our historic districts. After all, our participation in its history unites us in the places and spaces that become significant in our lives. We've just witnessed one of our nation's most poignant examples on January 6th at the US Capitol.
Oh my God.
Our historic districts have been eloquently described in the revised HDC design guidelines, or standards now. And I'm glad they've chosen that word, standards. Now what's needed is the necessary backbone to uphold these standards, the teeth and the will to do so. If upheld by the Secretary's standards and supported by additional descriptions in the LUMO, I think this is possible. Otherwise, developers and lawyers will continue to find easy loopholes in this document, and money will talk and take over, as I've seen in too many cases during my 9 years of service on this commission. This work requires putting the common good of our shared history of place over the monetary desires for bigger and bigger houses and garages. Linking macrocosm to microcosm by including sustainability practices in this document is an important step forward, as it provides a measure for homeowners in these districts to use. The new HDC standards reinforce their role as stewards, privileged with the task of maintaining and protecting Chapel Hill's unique historic and cultural heritage. Let us all unite as stewards in this cause. In Section 7(1)(c) of the State Model Ordinance, the exterior features subject to HDC review explicitly include landscape and natural features. So it's clear that the SHPO experts think trees and plantings ought to be subject to HDC review. The City of Oaks, Raleigh, has a tree ordinance, and their historic districts greatly benefit from that statute. The Hillsborough HDC has purview over significant trees and open spaces in their districts. Why not Chapel Hill? Our town arborist has limited landscape purview only on commercial properties. The LUMA was written before the town's historic districts were created. In workshops with David Owens of the UNC School of Government, the state recognizes the HDC standards taking precedence when formulating opinions on COAs. Yet here we are again, struggling to protect the landscape, open space, and charm that draws people to Chapel Hill. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Rayner, you're next.
Anya, thank you so much. I couldn't disagree any more with the person that just spoke. And as somebody who went through this process where things were completely subjective and unclear from step one to when we didn't receive our COA, even once ordered after 2 times before the BOA, the idea of arming any commission, including this one, which had a hard enough time doing what they were supposed to do, with the ability to deny a COA strictly based on a tree or landscaping, would be the utmost weaponization of any tool ever allowed. And I am going to continue to voice to the town council and the mayor that that is purview that should not be put anywhere close to the HDC. As somebody who's now will be living in and lives right next to the historic district, I of course agree that I don't want to see certain things come or bigger places than necessary being done. But the idea that you're going to try to find a way to keep it in a manner and a state that a few people want is not what this is about. It's about having a fair and balanced and known process so that when somebody goes through, it's clear what can and can't be done, not what you want it to be, but what it is. And the only thing I will say is, I congratulate the current HDC members, and I congratulate the folks that have worked very hard on putting this information together, because it is a step forward in helping to explain, as a homeowner who's going to go through or has to go through this process, some of the pieces. However, arming somebody with more ability to turn things down because you don't like that what was once a buildable lot is now going to have a house in it because it takes away open space is not what we're trying to do here. And if it is, then I've lost my way through this process. So my only comment is, my hope is, you've done a great job taking a step forward and making things so much clearer on so many levels here. Let's remember what the task is at hand. And I guess I'm completely lost in the idea that never did I ever read or ever, as I've gone through this process, heard from Anya, the commission members that have been doing this, that you were discouraging people to come and give testimony or to stand up and speak. And maybe I missed something if that was the case. So the idea that, you help people understand standing is one thing, but the fact that some people are going to read that that's discouraging people to be involved is just, I guess I'm lost, having read this numerous times since you've started. But, I'll look forward to what the commission members have to say when they get their cracks at reading this and see how their feeling is about this. But I guess I don't know. I'm not surprised I've heard what I've heard today, but encouraged that I hope the commission members that are here will stand by the good work that they've done.
Thank you. Laura, if you're still interested in speaking, you can go next. And I would remind everybody, if your hand is raised, but you've spoken and you don't need to speak again, if you could lower your hand, that would help us out.
Hi, everybody. My husband and I bought our home in the historic district about 2 years ago. It's a home that was built in the 90s on a street of homes also built in the 90s. It happens to fall in the Historical Commission. Previously, I'd lived in a historic district in Boston, and I grew up outside of Chicago. So I've kind of seen a spectrum of different levels of kind of historic regulation. And the thing that's, I think, most striking about Chapel Hill, I mean, it's a beautiful area. I'm very thankful for the Historical Commission and all of the work that they do, which is why we chose to live in a beautiful historic area. But it's how inefficient it is and how it's been delaying projects that apply to our property, even though it's not actually a historic home and neither are any of the houses on our street. And trying to have as clear and transparent a process with very clear guidelines, both for our contractors, for ourselves as we go through these projects, where it's no longer the subjective thing where a group of people are voicing their personal opinions, but there's something much more well-defined and quantitative, if at all possible, so that it can go more efficiently. And having things that at the city level that can be approved without it going to full committee, I think will help with that efficiency. Obviously, I don't want a big, purple hippo going up in my neighbor's yard. I don't want some gigantic house being, plopped on a property near ours. I like the green space and the trees, and that's why we chose to live here. But having a system that is fair and much more efficient, I think will benefit everyone and be much more similar to kind of the historical processes that I'm used to living with in Boston, which, are just more well-defined and function well. But thank you for having this meeting.
Thank you. Nancy Oates, you are next.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to add my thanks to the task force, the subcommittee, for all the hard work that you've done. I think this really has improved it a lot. And I also want to thank Bev for very eloquently talking about the issue of standing. A historic district is a public trust, and it really requires not just the people who are living on one side or the other of the house that's applying for a COA, but it's really everybody, so that you can keep that historic feel to it. And it's also beneficial to the town in that it brings in tourist dollars. And if you lose the historic character of that, you lose the tourist dollars. And part of that is having green space around a house. I don't know how you can add that into the standard, but because it sounds like what you're saying is that legally you can't say you make a change in the massing or what's allowed in the massing or the floor area ratio. But it seems like other towns have done that, where they've been able to preserve some of the green space around the house, the historic house. And I'd love to find out how they do that. And the other thing too, Randall's comments about the discrepancies between the LUMO and the guidelines or the standards. I remember when I was on council and I was the council liaison to the HDC, Bob Epting was the chair at the time, and he spent quite a lot of time drafting a memo that was presented to council that was able to make sure that that the LUMO and the guidelines did not conflict. And when that was presented to council, we were told that, oh, that'll be taken up later when you do the guideline revision. So now that you're into that, I'm wondering if the subcommittee has seen that memo that the HDC submitted. It would have been 2019, maybe 2018. It was a while ago. But I could forward that to the commission if you haven't seen it, if you haven't taken it into consideration. But I want to make sure that those really are taken seriously, so that it's not a situation where by the time this comes back to council, council says, oh, well, it's too late. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a quick update, I know there has been a lot of concern from both the historic district commissioners and the community about the A through J criteria in the LUMO. And that is something that we're looking at, especially now as we're sort of wrapping up this design guideline project, is moving forward with a text amendment to address that, since they don't cleanly align with the current design guidelines. Alan Reimer, you're next on my list. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, do you need to see the memo that the HDC sent a year or two ago?
If
I
you
can-
want to
I'm
send it
happy
to
to
me,
forward that.
that would be great. I can incorporate it into the public comment from this meeting and
Okay.
put it on the design guideline webpage.
All right, great. I'll do that after the meeting. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Alan Reimer, you're next on the list. And as a reminder, just to help me keep track, if you spoke and you no longer need to, just make sure you remove the raise the hand. Otherwise, I'm probably going to call on you again.
Thanks, Anya. And thanks to the task force that has begun what I was saying to Anya in an email, started almost 10 years ago when we suggested that this work be done. I'd like to also thank Bev for her comments. I think they were spot on and are consistent with where she's been forever on these issues. Unfortunately, I'm late to the game. I was saying to Anya that for some reason, I was never on anybody's mailing list, and I knew this was going to be going on, but I did not know was going on. And so I've not read the document yet. I intend to do that. And what I'm going to be doing when I read the document is to read it and interpret it as if I have no flexibility to put my personal opinion into it. So that when there is a statement made, it's a concrete statement. I can remember on my time on the commission when folks would argue about the size of a picket in a fence. Totally irrelevant in the bigger picture, but it could consume a half an hour of discussion in a meeting. And so and because I'm an engineer and I like quantification, to the extent that we can quantify things so that there isn't the ability for a commissioner to impose their particular personal opinion on a decision, I think will be very important. And that's the end of it. That's all I really need to say. I'll pass on my comments directly to Anya, but I think certainly when I believe it was Randall that was speaking, talking about the issues that relate directly to the problems that people have had and have decided not to do anything in the historic district because of the problems associated with the guidelines, I think, have deterred more than we know. Certainly they did on my time on the commission. I do think that the document, this new document itself, is at least graphically a lot stronger than the older one. And that's very helpful to the extent that those graphics make any difference. But I look forward to delving into this thing a little bit and hopefully making some offline comments on what's going on. Thanks very much, Anya.
All right, thank you. Bev, I'm showing that your hand is raised. I'm not sure. Did you want to speak again?
Yes, please. Thank you. If the commission members would look at page 13 of the draft document, I think that it could be improved tremendously simply by, okay, so then on page 13, go to the heading hearings. And I think that the document could be improved tremendously by removing simply this one sentence. Only those who have legal standing may participate as a party during the hearing. Now, you all have that underlined, which makes it stand out on the page. And that is wrong. It is fine to have the first part of that paragraph. The COA is a hearing is conducted as a quasi-judicial hearing where a decision is based on the evidence and testimony presented. And then you could go on with, when you come to the other witnesses sentence, simply say, witnesses should or may or are encouraged to present competent, material, and substantial evidence that is not repetitive as allowed by the commission. In other words, you could get the idea in there of what you're looking for from the people who speak without being so dogmatic about who you don't want to hear from. Thank you.
Randy, do you want to speak again?
Sure. I'm always surprised in these meetings, and I end up feeling like the villain in a James Bond movie when I ask for clarity and repeatability and simplicity in the process. And it's really just the opposite. I love old buildings. I've worked on them literally my entire life. And I do a ton of work in Chapel Hill historic districts. And I just want the process to be better. I want the HDC to support the community and the character of the district rather than do what I know it's doing right now, because I have direct, specific examples of the ways that the cumbersome and unpredictable and subjective process is chasing away investment and restoration and preservation of buildings in Chapel Hill. So even though I'm sure I violently disagree with many of the folks on this call about how that should be done, I'd like to hope that folks can understand that the goal is probably shared. And also the information that I shared about public opinion being irrelevant is not my own opinion. It is from the handbook that's basically considered the guide for quasi-judicial bodies. And I included an excerpt from that book that was actually originally presented by Amber Stimpson, that talks about how those decisions must be made based on the rules. So this isn't sort of a discussion about who we think we should be able to talk or how it should happen. It's basically a standard for how quasi-judicial bodies must operate. And then I'll do one other specific thing. Heather, I believe you mentioned, like you talked about that maybe it wasn't super clear in the standard, which standard applies to which application. And if you have a question about that, again, my experience is 100% it will get screwed up. It will be confusing, and it won't just confuse the applicants, it'll confuse the commissioners. So I have been advocating for a separate section of strictly standards that only apply to COAs that are written, and I've always been fine with A through J in the LUMO, and I'd be fine if the standards for the COA were key to those items and just added additional clarity and specific information. But I don't think that history says that that difference and what applies to what will become clear. I think it'll get worse. And so I would strongly encourage you to write these things in a way that's repeatable and clear and understandable, rather than hoping it works out.
So I can just jump in. Maybe I was unclear. I didn't say that I didn't know which standards applied to which things. I said that not all standards would apply to every project. So obviously if you have, if you're repairing windows, the standards about window replacement or, installing new windows and things are not going to apply. That was sort of what I meant, that every single standard in this document doesn't apply to every project. So that was what I meant.
So do you think that each one of the applications will be that clear that it's about windows, so you look at the Windows standard? Or do you think that there's room for misinterpretation where somebody jumps to a different section?
I can't really speak to how the application looks or how the commission hears things, but presumably it would start with windows, and it may also include standards for wood if they're wood windows. I think that's also part of the sort of guiding of the HDC as they hear applications.
The standard, and this is in many of them, and I've seen a ton of no votes and confusion on the issue around the like materials. I forget how it's, I've written it down. The sections that show a retain and preserve material standard, and architectural metals, wood, they're in many of those places. And the question always comes up is retain and preserve which materials? The original materials, if you know what they are the ones that were installed in 1940 or 1960 or 1990 or 2005? And how do you pick that point in time? And how does that choice reasonably relate to congruity, which again is the narrow standard that they're making the decision on? And the fact that that's in each one of the materials categories will definitely continue to yield issues and confusion and struggles in the process. The best laugh I've had in a long time is when I was going through the document over the last week. There's actually a picture of a house with a lovely patinaed copper metal roof. And I thought, how ironic that that serves as the example in this document when it took me almost 3 years to reach a legal settlement on installing that roof. To this day, I have the COA that I fought for with the clients hanging on my wall because the COA actually lists that the owner nor any employee of my company can go up on that roof and scrub or polish the copper. That's worthwhile. But the message that I want to send to this team is that there's still significant lack of clarity and major problems with the HDC that's limiting investment and preservation, the very things that you want to promote. And that has to be fixed. This is the opportunity to do it. And well, I want to be appreciative of some of the great things that have happened, like the description of the character of the districts, which is directly applicable, or the staff approval items, which is great, or the new construction section, which is great. It is still not clear enough to function well, and it is not remotely tied or connected to the LUMO, which is the actual law. And anyway, I just feel like we've got a long ways to go on this thing. And for a while, there hasn't been the sort of the restart that needed to happen to have this thing be clear enough to be a functional basis for the HDC moving forward. I'm sorry to be a wet blanket, but this thing still needs some work.
Thank you for that. So let me move on because we do have some other hands that are raised and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Susan Smith, you're next. Susan, do you want to unmute? Do you still want to speak?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I just want to say that there's been work, I've been working behind the scenes on this project, and there has been work, speaking to what Nancy Oates was saying, in trying to come up with a floor area ratio that would work to help protect open space. So I hope that that goes forward, and it would be different for the different districts and for the different streets. So partly one of my concerns still is that comparisons are, it sounds like in these standards that comparisons are going to be with the whole district. That means all the 3 districts? That's partly a question to you. Or do you mean the specific district in which the house or property is located?
I think we actually went through that and we tried to add additional detail. And I think we were talking about it. And when you look at the context that you start on a streetscape, and Heather, correct me if I'm wrong about, I think we kind of defined it like you look at the block, then you look at the neighborhood, then you look at the specific district that you're in.
Okay, well, the way it reads to me, the way I read it, the way it sounded is like you had to compare it to all the district as a whole. It says the district as a whole, and that was misleading to me because I thought they were talking about the whole districts. On the point about public opinion, I agree public opinion is irrelevant, but that's not what a lot of people brought to the meetings. They weren't just bringing their opinion. And I take issue with the fact that we commissioners were just putting forth our personal likes and dislikes. We were trying our best to follow what was written in the guidelines and apply it. And I know that there are people on this call that resent having space being considered or the backyard even being considered, but we have to be concerned with the whole. It's a three-dimensional experience you have walking down the street. You don't just look at the front of a house. You look at the side. If you're in the backyard of the neighbor, you look at the backyard. It's all important. So the last thing I would say is I wondered if under the qualifications for commissioners, I think there should be a statement included in this that even though realtors and architects and landscape architects are important people to serve on the commission, I would like to see it made law that, or made an additional thing that people who are, while they are serving on the Historic District Commission, they forgo accepting business in the historic districts. And I think there's a great conflict of interest when that's happened. And I experienced that when I was on the board. Thank you.
Thank you. Coulter Debris.
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks Anya. I just wanted to get on and speak in support of Randy. I think there's a huge silent majority that's not being heard. I own 5 properties in one of the historic districts. I was there speaking on behalf of a neighbor about 2 years ago, and honestly, it was possibly the most discouraging incident I've ever had with the town of Chapel Hill. Just the unreasonableness from the HDC. So the problem with HDC guidelines that I see, there is still so much subjectivity, even the new ones. So I just, again, support some of the other comments. The more we can do to get the subjectivity out of it, I would love to say even as little subjectivity as possible and removing as many regulations that could lead to subjectivity, because from my experience, the council just was not reasonable. The other point is, I don't know if there's anything to look into as to a better appeals process, other ways if the committee is not being reasonable, how to, what the recourse is for property owners. But I just, again, want to support some of the comments on the other side of this, that I just think, I personally don't think I would ever live in the historic district again, having experienced the process and how difficult it's been. So. And I know there's a lot of people that are not on this call that would agree with that.
Thank you. And Bev, it looks like your hand is up again.
Yeah. I hear the passion in the voices of Coulter and Randall, and it's particularly painful to realize or think that the experience of interacting with the town has been so unpleasant. And of course, it should never be that way. So I am in sympathy with those points of view. I think it's important for people to understand that that the standings, as I understand it, were put into state law for special use permits and for conditional use permits. And in the last 40 years, I have not been aware of them, of standings being used in connection with historic district regulations. However, they have been used recently in a couple of the court cases that went to the courts in North Carolina. Whether this is the right way to figure out how we conduct our historic districts is a big question in my mind. I think that there is a better way. Thank you.
Coulter, I noticed your hand still raised. Would you like to speak again? No. Okay. Is anybody else wishing to speak? You can always use the raise your hand function and it shows up and I'll call your name. Susan Smith.
Yes, I just would also say there are probably many people, I know there are many people that were very satisfied with the work of the Historic District Commission, and it was quite smooth. And those people aren't here tonight, but there were many, many cases which went through without much problem at all. There are a few contentious cases, and those voices are pretty loud, but there were also, the many, many cases that went through quite well. But I agree that the making this document shorter or smaller, or tightening up what is really vital to the decisions that will be made is really important. And so I also think there's much more work to be done on it, and I look forward to participating in that. And thank you.
Randy, I'll call on you again.
Just wanted to respond to one of Susan's comments. The last certificate of appropriateness we applied for was successful at the first meeting and went really well. So because I'm talking about ways to make the process work better and be more clear and more fair to the residents of Chapel Hill, does not mean that I've never had a positive experience. And in fact, sorry, Anya, because this will feel a little bit like pandering, but I think the staff is awesome. They've been really responsive to us and what have you. But I think that the commissioners are strapped by a process that's unclear, and I do think that subjectivity finds its way into many of the decisions. Anyway, it's not all bad. That's what I was trying to say.
Susan, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. Thank you for that. We are just volunteers, and there was very minimal training when I started earlier in the early 2000s. Very little training, and we are supposed to go to training, and we often did, but still, it takes a while to be able to understand the complexity of our historic districts and what to take into account and all of that. So anyway, I appreciate your comment there.
All right, J. Matthew Martin, would you like to be next?
Hey everybody, very interesting discussion. I'd like to thank the staff. I've had multiple applications, all of which staff has done a superb job on. And although some have been cumbersome, I've not had a negative experience. So thank you. And thank you for the work you put in on this. With regard to standing, I'd like to say this. Evidence is evidence, and pontificating is pontificating. And if having a standing rule helps the commissioners separate out pontificating from evidence, then I'm all for it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Would anybody else like to speak? All right, seeing no one, if it's all right with all of you, I think we can end this meeting early. I will add my email address to the chat box. And so if anybody has any additional comments that they'd like to share, I'm happy to post those online tomorrow and share those with the HDC. And by all means, thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it and the feedback that you provided.